We are live here for episode 10 of the MMA Debate Show. How to come out strong with a big guest and James Lynch. Thanks so much for joining me, man. How are you?
I'm awesome, Lucas. Thank you so much for having me on. Excited to debate with you, as it says in the title.
Of course. First things first, though, let the people know, where do you work in this MMA industry and where can we find you on social media?
Well, I would hope people who are watching already know where I work, but if they don't,
Right.
senior MMA news editor at The Score, youtube.com/TheScore MMA, always putting out original content. That's the goal here. It's a crowded MMA space, so we're trying to fit our way in there with original content. We just dropped the podcast today with Michael Bisping, Corey Sandhagen, Patricio Pitbull. Really good show today. So if you guys check that out after this, of course, that would be much appreciated. And like it says in the banner here, at Lynch on Sports is where you can find me on Twitter.
There we go. Perfect. I remember when we used to ask you where you work, it would take 10 minutes just naming all the outlets.
now we get it took a bit. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but now you get like the one nice fancy senior MMA editor at The Score. It sounds good. Sounds clean.
Yeah, no, it's a lot easier, and again, we can get through these intros a lot faster. So it just means I can talk more, which is the purpose of these shows. So it's great.
There we go. Perfect. All right. So listen, we're going to get to a bunch of stuff about UFC 248. First things first, though. Yesterday, we found out PFL signed a bunch of people. Aaron Bronsteter put out a tweet. They signed even more people. So I want to start with you on this one. What are your thoughts on PFL, the people they're signing, what they're doing heading into season 3?
Yeah, I like some of the names they brought in. Olivier Aubin-Mercier, a guy that, up here in Canada, we know quite well. He was an Ultimate Fighter. I always forget if he won or he was a finalist. I think he was a finalist. Can't remember. But, that's a good signing. They got Johnny Case back. They got Mo Usman, who I saw you interviewed. Really like Mo Usman. I think the UFC missed the boat on not signing him. He is the brother of Kamaru Usman, but very talented guy on the regional scene. They signed Martin Hamlet. I just saw today the Dutch fighter. That's going to be an interesting signing. Actually, sorry, not Dutch, but he's a European fighter. Is kind of what I'm getting at. And then this already adds to the list of fighters like Rory McDonald and just some of the other big names there. So I think I like some of the moves they're making. The only concern I have, I guess, is like some of the names they brought through. I don't know if that's going to translate to viewership. I mean, they're certainly talented fighters, but I don't know if it's necessarily the type of names that are going to really, other than Rory. I mean, Rory, I think people no matter what will watch, but I think some of the names are good fighters, but I don't know if that'll translate into viewership. So we'll see how that works out, but it certainly fits sort of the mold of what they want to do in getting, talented fighters on their tournament seasons.
Yeah, so I'm definitely a big fan of what they're doing. The biggest thing for me is when we saw back in New Year's, they had all these fights in the finals, and the reaction on Twitter was lackluster. People weren't very happy about it. Like, oh, really? These are the fights for $1 million? And watching Jared Roshoff fight for $1 million, I mean, people weren't big fans of that. And so what I like is that everybody mentioned that they didn't like it. They didn't think the names were big enough. And what the PFL did is they were basically like, we hear you, and so we're going to make some changes. They go out, they sign, Rory McDonald. We found out actually a few days beforehand, but so they sign a bunch of names. What I like about it is it shows that they heard the people. They're bringing on names that I think if you're a casual MMA fan, you mentioned a little bit, you don't really, Muhammad Usman, you might recognize the last name. There's some people you might not necessarily recognize, but if you follow MMA enough, there's going to be plenty of names that you recognize. People like Bubba Jenkins, who I also talked to yesterday, and things like that. There are going to be some names that look familiar. I think in terms of reaching the casual fans, they're not going to get there yet. It's going to take some time. And I think for the casuals, you're really going to have to put forth this whole tournament with the $1 million to do it. Not so much with the signings, but the biggest thing I like about it is that I think the people are going to feel heard in terms of they went out there, they signed a bunch of names. You're going to start recognizing more and more people in the tournament. And it's not a bunch of people that have last names that sound like Nurmagomedov out there and that people are having trouble being attached to. What I like is now you're going to look at it like, oh, Muhammad Usman, of course, Bubba Jenkins, of course, Olivier Aubin-Mercier. There's another person that I recognize. I like that they're signing people that if you follow MMA a little bit, you're going to recognize some of these guys.
You are. My only concern is like the names are names that we know as far as the hardcore MMA audience, but some of for example, like I look at like a Thiago Alves or like a Hector Lombard, like those are like notable names, guys that have fought for titles. Well, not Lombard, but Alves did. Those and like. I agree those guys are probably past their prime. They probably wouldn't do quite well in the tournament, but I do think that they need to add some more of names like that. People give Bellator a lot of flack about some of the signings they've made and how, they get a lot of the UFC fighters that are kind of past their prime, so to speak. But I think there is a method to that in the sense that they can use that to headline cards. My only worry with this is, and again, I think some of the fighters here, and some of them we didn't even mention, Marcin Held, good pick up there. Justin Willis, who, was in the UFC, but is Willis really like a household name? It's really tough to say. So they're going to to have to work really hard to sell the story, so to speak. I mean, being on ESPN, it's a good platform for them. They can, try and, get people out there. Like, for example, Mo Usman, I would sell the fact 100% that he is Kamaru Usman's brother. I would run with that. And, because that's what's going to get people interested here. Just the same way like Bellator picked up Keith Lee, Kevin Lee's brother. Like, that's what you need to do, is to get people interested. Because I think the casual fan, like, out there, and when I think of casual fans, I think of someone like my dad. Like, my dad looked at this list, he wouldn't have a clue who anyone is. But if you bring over like a Rory McDonald, he'd know. But I think they're going to have to. I hope it works out. I like the fact that they're getting talented guys, but I think they do need a bit more notable fighters that even the casual fan would know. And I think that will sort of hurt their viewership for some of these cards. But we'll see what happens. I hope it all works out, because, like I've always said, more MMA for the fighters is better, giving them more options.
Yeah, I do agree with you with that point. Like, yeah, if you're a casual fan, you probably haven't heard of these guys, and that's fair. But I think for PFL, the big name signings, I don't know if that's what's going to bring over the casual fans. For me, the fact that they picked a gimmick, you do this tournament that's kind of like the NBA, and then you win the $1 million. I think that's going to have more an effect on them getting more fans and reaching more people than it is with the actual fighters. Because if you think about it, Rory McDonald, I mean, it's a good signing for sure, but who are you really going to sign that is going to have people say, oh, we have to watch PFL? You mentioned your father being a casual fan. I don't know. I don't have any friends. I don't know anyone that actually follows MMA that knows what they're talking about. You really got to convince people to go with you at a bar to watch the stuff. So I think of my friend, we were watching a Bellator one time, and he's looking at me and he was like, man, is this is this the B leagues? Is this amateur? What is this? And you got to try to explain to him, like, man, this is, right there at the level of the sporting thing. My point is that it's through the production value that I think you're also going to bring in fans. If you look professional, if you look good, if you look like you could potentially rival the UFC, being on ESPN Plus, having a few names we might be able to recognize, I think they're on the right path. But in terms of bringing in casuals, Bellator already having trouble doing it. I'm not sure if PFL is going to be able to do it, especially just trying to sign up bigger names.
Possibly. I kind of, this is why we're doing a debate show here, which is good. I can kind of disagree with you a little bit here, but Bellator has their model. Like, they can make cards where there's, headliners that people know about. Like, I know Josh Barnett's not fighting this weekend, but had he fought, I think people would be tuning in just to see how Josh Barnett would do. I think you need a mix. I think you need to build your talent. I think PFL's done a good job of that as far as some of the names they have there. It's unfortunate some of their champions don't speak a lot of English, so that's going to be a drawback. But you have to do a combination. You have to build stars. Like, I like what Bellator is doing. Like, here, and I don't have a Bellator t-shirt on. I'm not trying to sell them as a promotion, but I do like kind of what they've done where, they brought over Ryan Bader, where I think the UFC probably should have kept him because, they need light heavyweights right now. And he's sort of become a star for them. But on the flip side, they also have built good talent. They have AJ McKee. They have, up and comers that they're building around. And I think that's the best recipe for success to bring in new viewers. Like, I look at some of these names here, like a lot of them are, sort of mid-tier fighters, no real notable prospects, so to speak. Like, I think that's like someone like Usman has potential. I think there's definitely someone that people will be paying attention to there. But, I look at like a Johnny Case, for example, UFC vet, he fought last year in PFL. He did all right, but not a guy that I think people are really rushing to watch. I mean, he's an entertaining fighter, but I think it's got to be that combination where they need to do a better job of, building their superstars and building fighters within their promotion, but also have a mix of fighters that when you see them fight, you're like, oh yeah, that guy's fighting. I want to tune in. So we'll see how it unfolds. I think being on ESPN certainly helped them last year, but they've got to do a better job of captivating the audience because, I was reading some of the ticket numbers from last year. They weren't very good. They've also got to figure out the schedule a little bit better. That's something we haven't talked about yet. They did a show on Halloween last year. Why would you do that? Like, people are not going to, people are out getting dressed up and going trick-or-treating or going to Halloween parties. Their chances, like, if you're a guy, the chances of you trying to bring your significant other to an MMA fight over a Halloween party are probably, that's a tough negotiation. I've been there plenty of times when it's come to things like that. And then the New Year's show, like, I do think that's a bad idea. I know they do show, I know, there's other promotions, the UFC's done, New Year's shows before, but I think that's also a bad idea. I think, I've sort of learned just being in this business, like anytime you do an event around Christmas time, it's usually bad news. I think that's part of the reason you saw the UFC stop doing those closer, those shows after Christmas and just do, fights before that. If you remember, 245 was earlier this year and then they didn't have a year-end pay-per-view. I think that's a better method because you got to look at like the holidays and things like that. I think them being on sort of midweek, I think is good. But, from my perspective, Lucas, like it's tough. Like I got a family, like I can't dedicate time to watching PFL, it's usually on Thursday, I think, right? Like it's tough to catch every single one when it's on during that time slot. Now I know people will then say, well, you can't put it on Saturday or Friday because, then you're going to be competing with, Bellator, UFC. But I think they should do sort of a combo of where you do some of them on Thursday. But if you see a weekend where the UFC is not doing an event, throw that on a Saturday. I know it's tough with venues and it's tough to schedule. They have to schedule stuff well in advance. It's easier said than done than a guy sitting behind a computer screen right now. But I think in general, it's something they should at least look at because there are some gaps in the schedule with UFC and Bellator. Everyone complains there's no MMA on. Well, here's a good opportunity for them. So I think, that's another issue. I think is the scheduling as well. They need to figure out a way to utilize that a little bit better. I said a lot there, but you kind of go with it.
No, you made a really great point with the schedule. I mean, first of all, Thursday night, when you do that and you start your main cards around 10 or even 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you already cut off all of your European audience and your people that are in time zones that aren't going to be able to watch it. I know myself, for example, I'm in France. So, usually on Thursday, either I have work or I have school the next day or an internship, whatever I have going on. And it's like, that card's probably not good enough for me to stay up and then come in groggy with 5 cups of coffee the next day at work. I mean, you already cut off everyone that's in a kind of a funky time zone. So for me, it's like just that. And the fact they took this huge break. I know their thing is we're the season, we're doing the off season and stuff. It's interesting. I don't know if that's necessarily what's going to make people tune in, but it's an interesting concept. But look at this enormous break we have. We haven't talked about PFL until they sign these guys. That's 3 months since the last time we saw them. And now we're talking about because they have signings. And then next week, PFL will cease to exist until they do something again. And I don't think the fights start until May, June or something like that. So like you mentioned, the schedule, the times are on. There's a lot of things going on that's kind of going to, I want to say alienate, but make it tough for them to grow because you're not going to have that many people watching.
Yeah, no, you make a great point. Those gaps that does hurt. If you remember when Bellator used to run their tournaments, they were still year round. I mean, it did get a little much when you're like, having to put like Eric Prindle in a main event or something like that, right? Where, the cards are a bit weaker, but you're right. I think they should look at, putting some of the fighters in like, fights that are sort of exhibition, or they could have, maybe make it like, I seem to remember the first year they did PFL before they started the season tournament, they did do cards, and like if you won that you would get like more points in the season or something like that. So I understand for some of the fighters, it's it can be fatigue. Like fighting that much can take its toll. I've talked to plenty of fighters, I know you have too, where, cutting weight can be a bit of an issue because you're fighting so close together. But I'm with you. They have to spread this out a little bit more, at least get a card, I mean, we're 3 months into the year, nothing with PFL so far. Like do something, get some of your fighters on there. Even, I would even look at getting other fighters on the roster. And if they impress, then throw them in the tournament because there's injuries, there's things that happen. And that's something as well that they need to look into. One other thing we haven't talked about, I wanted to sort of segue onto is the rules. They really have to make those a lot clearer because there was a couple situations last year. Like I remember there was like a draw and then like they gave it to the guy who had like more wins or something. I don't even know the rules like to the full extent because it's just like it's tough to sort of keep track. So they got to make those a little bit clearer too. And for example, like here's something they got to not do again. Like, and no offense to Alex Gilpin, I like him, great interview, great fighter, but he shouldn't have fought Lance Palmer in the finals last year. They had fought 2 times already. I know Pineda tested positive. Jeremy Kennedy lost to Pineda. Pineda got popped for steroids. Throw Kennedy in the finals. It's a fresh matchup. They got to figure out things like that too, because that was a big turnoff as well, where you're having, these fighters have like trilogy fights in the span of a year when it's just not needed. Like no one is dying to see a third fight between Alex Gilpin and Lance Palmer. Like they got to figure that out too. So I know I've been a little critical here, but I'm saying it out of love. I want to see them do well. I want to see them make improvements here. Ray Sefo, don't be calling my phone right now. I want to make sure that this is something that's viable and it's something that fans are going to tune into. And I think I got a decent idea of what people want to watch because like yourself, I'm a content creator.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing with the rules, and I think they also have something weird about elbows, like or knees, or there's one of those rules. I'm not even 100% sure. Or we saw Will Brooks in the first season get eliminated because he I think lost the first round but won the second. And people aren't gonna like that. And fighters, they're gonna come do these interviews and they're gonna complain about it. They're gonna talk about it. So definitely some funky things with the rules. You mentioned the trilogies. I mean, how many times is Ray Cooper gonna fight Jake Shields? I mean, listen, it was cool the first time, maybe the second time. By the 16th time, it's like I'm good. I don't really, But here's the last thing on PFL, the last kind of question. In your opinion, what's PFL's ceiling as a promotion?
I think it'll always sort of be second or third fiddle, I should say, sort of behind Bellator and the UFC. I don't see them, like, the tournament format's cool. I think if you're going to be a third seed in this, sort of war of promotions, the tournament idea is great. Like, I actually, like, I know I'm in the minority here and people are probably going to yell at me in the chat here, but I like the old Bellator tournament format. I thought it was good. The reason, like, the tournament format had its merits where, a guy like Michael Chandler, who, went through the tournament, fought Eddie Alvarez in the finals and then beat Eddie Alvarez. Like, he earned his way to the final, and then fighting a guy like Alvarez, that put him over the top. And as we know now, Chandler's one of the faces of the promotion. But had they not done that tournament, I don't think people would have cared that Chandler fought Alvarez at the time, because he, it was just sort of a, an up and coming fighter. And Alvarez, at that point was sort of a veteran. He'd fought in Dream and Elite XC and everywhere else. So yeah, I think there were some merits to the tournament. So I like the tournament idea. And I think it's good for fighters who don't necessarily have to rely on trash talk to see, where they stand. Like we're seeing this year in the UFC, where wins and losses don't matter if you want a title shot, apparently. So right. I think it's good to see, and I think you see some of the fighters here where they were sort of like that. A lot of the names on here, they're not fighters that are talking a lot of trash and trying to move their way up. So I think, from that perspective, it definitely holds its place. But I think unless somehow Bellator goes out of business, which you never know. I mean, there's a lot of things happening right now in media. I think PFL is probably going to be number 3. And I know people throw out one championship and Combate Americas, but there's some issues with some of their viewership as well, which we can get into on another show, I'm sure. But I do see them as sort of the number 3 right now, behind Bellator and the UFC.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I see them as number 3. I think the big advantage they have is that they're on ESPN Plus. If that can be used correctly, if that can be marketed correctly, I think they could maybe edge out Bellator. But as of right now, Bellator really are that number 2 staple. Right now, they're number 3. Ceiling, you're not going to beat the UFC realistically, let's be honest. But you could potentially rival Bellator, get number 2. The question is, can they build that homegrown talent? Can they have like a Michael Venom Page like at Bellator? Can they build these stars? Muhammad Usman could be somebody interesting if they can market him correctly. So that's the
one more quick thing I just thought of as we're about to move on.
Yeah.
I did the cardinal sin here. I interrupted the host, but I just thought of something like what they should look at doing, because they're on ESPN, and I don't know how much money they have available. I know they have a lot of investors. It doesn't seem to matter about the money, but they should look into doing like some sort of show, not like the Ultimate Fighter. Like I think the Ultimate Fighter ran its course because like they really tried to force things. They put everyone in the house. They gave them alcohol. They didn't give them TV. Makes everyone go nuts. There's drama, right? But what I'd like to see is like an embedded style thing where maybe you follow the lives of these fighters in the tournament. I got to fight. I just won my fight, but I got to fight next week. Like that to me is interesting. People want human stories. Part of the reason the Ultimate Fighter was so successful in the beginning was because there was nothing like it out there, and we never really had sort of these storylines that you saw with fighters. And I think that was one of the reasons that it was successful, where you see a guy like Forrest Griffin or Chris Liebman who had like an alcohol addiction and things like that, and you can relate to it as a viewer. And I think that's one of the things. Like I see a lot of even for me, as much as I cover the sport, there's fighters in PFL that I don't know that much about, and I might see their record on Tapology, but I don't know, what are they like, outside of the cage. That's something they really have to work on for the next season. And I think programming is the way to do that. And just do like they could even do something online. It doesn't even have to be something that airs on ESPN, but do something like an embedded style series that's going to captivate my interest and get them to do fun stuff and sort of see that human side of it. It's easier said than done. I mean, I've even tried to do video content like that, and it's sometimes tough to get there. But I think that's something they should at least consider and do something like a reality show or something behind the scenes that really gets us to know these fighters. Because I think a lot of times you just see, Russian fighter versus some UFC vet, and that's that. There could be so much more to that, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, especially on ESPN Plus, you can have stuff available on demand that, if you like PFL, you're curious about these fighters. I mean, right now they're depending on the media to do these interviews and get them out there. But yeah, I mean, you've got ESPN Plus, and you got to use that correctly. All right, so we do have a question in the chat from Max El-Kakui Holloway. I believe you are familiar with him.
Yeah, he's on my show a lot. He always comments. Good to hear you, Max.
So does UFC have to make a statement soon with venues blocking crowds at sporting events? And we will show the comment right here. We'll start with you, James. What do you think about this question?
That's cool. I got to learn how to do that on my show. I didn't know how to do the menu. I'll have to talk to you after. I'm learning something here.
That's the first time, and I'm being real confident with it. But so far, it's paying off.
No, I like it. That looks awesome. Okay. So he kind of worded that interestingly because it kind of sounds like the UFC needs to make a statement and do something here. But what he's trying to say is they got to make an announcement about the coronavirus that's happening. They do. I actually wrote about this in my Q&A today, which you can find on the score.com today. That they got to do something like. it seems like every 20 minutes, I'm just checking my Twitter feed, I'm seeing something new about the coronavirus. They have to figure this out. There's a couple big fights coming up, to Khabib and Tony Ferguson being one of them. They need to figure out if this is something that, like, if they have to move or they have to reschedule, they have to figure it out here. I was supposed to do a fighter interview today. Won't say the fighter because I don't want them to get in trouble, but they were telling me that their event might be in jeopardy because of this coronavirus. So, it's starting to pick up here a little bit, and the UFC does need to get ahead of this. I know Dana White did that interview with Aaron Bronstetter over the weekend and said basically that he's not worried about it. But I mean, this is happening to every sporting event. We're seeing the, March Madness being affected. We're seeing, I know the San Jose Sharks in the NHL. I'm a big hockey fan. They're having to, cancel home games, or they're having to do it. I don't know if it's in an empty arena or somewhere else, but they're having to change things up. So the UFC's got to get ahead of this before it bites them in the ass, because there's a lot of big cards and fights coming up, and they really need to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, we see the talk on Twitter of, the Apex Center and the things like that where they could do the fights. You have a venue to do it, but I just really hope they get behind this. And, I'm not willing to sacrifice Nurmagomedov Ferguson for like the 13th time. So hopefully they get behind it. If they're going to make something, yeah, obviously make a statement that that's the right way to go. But hopefully they're planning for this and they're not doing the Dana White thing where we're going to ignore it. And then if there's something last minute, then in that case, we'll do something about it.
Yeah, the UFC is actually, I mean, I will give them credit. Usually when things, hit the fan, they figure things out. I mean, this was the same promotion that tried to fly Max Holloway out from Hawaii to fight Khabib when Tony Ferguson tripped over a cable. So, I mean, they've tried to be creative when it comes to, figuring matchups out at the last minute. But I mean, this is something that we're seeing more and more. They got to get ahead of this and just, be on their A game. I'm sure they are, but just, we haven't heard anything so far.
All right, we have somebody asking a question about Anthony Johnson. We will get to that. It's one of the topics. But first, let's talk about UFC 248 and that event, whatever you want to call it. We saw this past weekend. First things first, what's your takeaway from that main event, Romero versus Adesanya?
I think it's pretty obvious. Adesanya did not want to get hit by Romero. I don't blame him, because a lot of guys have been put out by Yoel Romero in that fight. But I also, the blame is, I see a lot of people kind of blaming Adesanya for this because he's the champion, but Romero's got to take some blame as well. I mean, you've had 4 title shots. People forget that. If we're including interim title shots, he's had 4 opportunities, and that was his 4th over the weekend. When it's the 5th round or it's later in the fight, like, go for broke, do something. Don't do this. This is doing nothing. Like, it really is not going to win you any favorable points with the judges. So go for broke here. I think both guys, it was just disappointing. It was just one of those things where, Adesanya knows the power of Yoel Romero, so he's not going in the pocket with him. Michael Bisping, who I interviewed on the podcast, you can see it, like I said, on the Score channel, really articulated this quite well, where he said that, Adesanya didn't want to go in the pocket. Romero couldn't do much with his kicks because, Adesanya had the height and reach advantage. So it was just a bad style matchup. I mean, we've seen fights like this before. Go back and watch Damian Maia and Anderson Silva. Go watch Anderson Silva and Talis Latis. Like, those were fights that, I don't know if it was just Anderson, trying to avoid getting submitted or what the deal was, but they were, we've seen bad fights before, but it's unfortunate. Sometimes when you have fights on paper, people don't necessarily look at the style, and looking back on that matchup, I think that was a possibility where Adesanya did not want to get knocked out, but it's just so surprising because to a certain degree, because Adesanya was not afraid to go in there and stand and trade with Robert Whittaker, who also has knocked out people in that division. So just really disappointing. I think both the fighters, their stock went down. It sucked because we just had like a fight of the year before that with Joanna and Wei Li. And now here we are talking about, this main event, which should have been a great fight, which ended up being a stinker.
No, it's unfortunate because going into the fight, obviously you're talking about, does Yoel Romero deserve a title shot? No. But then you're like, well, you know what? But that matchup, though, we're going to get the fireworks. I mean, think about all the great fights they had. And then you finish the fight and you're like, damn it, they made us pay for it. We didn't deserve that fight. Nobody deserved it. And so we paid for it. For me, my biggest takeaway, I believe it's a little bit more Yoel Romero's fault. I mean, I believe they were saying on the broadcast that it was, this is what happens when you have 2 counter strikers against each other. I mean, yeah, but this is like the extreme version of that. Like, if every counter striker did that, let's not match any counter strikers against each other. For me, this was a case of Romero, I think, showing his age a little bit. I think he knew that going 5 rounds full speed with Israel wasn't really an option for him. And so the game plan, go out there, explode on him, try to find the opening. And we saw him land a few overhands and then, back away and then circle back and then not do anything with it. So it was unfortunate. I put a lot of blame on Yoel Romero for that. Obviously, I'm going to blame Israel as well because, it takes 2 to tango. But for me, this was a case of we're seeing Romero's cardio issues pop up. We're seeing his age become a factor. And, the takeaways is just hopefully the sooner we forget about this fight, the better.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what Adesanya's game plan is when he fights Paulo Costa. Paulo Costa also has knockout power, but I don't think he's as. I mean, he can knock guys out, but I think if you're looking at the two, Romero definitely packs more of a punch, I would think. But we'll see how that fight ends up playing out. But yeah, just disappointing all around.
But the big question for a lot of people though was, is this going to hurt any of their stocks, especially Israel? Is this going to hurt him in the long run? Well, what's your take on that?
I don't think it will. Anderson Silva, I just referenced two bad fights that he had. People don't seem to bring those up at all. So, I mean, if Adesanya can go out there and go on the type of winning streak that Anderson Silva had, beyond this, then I don't think people will care. It's just one fight. But if this happens again, like the next fight, for example, then we're going to get Dana White angry, and you don't want that to happen. I mean, I remember it was years ago, but I remember Dana White, giving it to Anderson Silva and saying, like, you fight like this again, we're going to cut you. I think it was something like that. It was something really bad where he was just like, really upset. So you certainly don't want to have your boss upset, and you don't want to have the fans upset. People pay money to go watch the fights. You don't want to have performances like that. So I think if he goes out there and fights Paulo Costa and knocks him out, or has a much better fight, then fans are going to forgive him. But you can't get in the habit of doing this. And for Romero, wherever he fights, like his manager says he's staying at middleweight, I think that's a mistake, because I mean, you're not 5 title shots in one division. I don't think that's ever happened. So we'll see where they decide to go from there. But both fighters need a big performance in their next fight.
Yeah, for this one, you have two different examples. You have, like you mentioned, Anderson Silva, who had 2 fights that, were very similar to that, and people don't remember him for that. And then you have Tyron Woodley, where he gives you a really terrible fight, and nobody ever lets him live him down. And now you think of him as not as the fighter he really is. So for Israel, it's a case of, he's already in dangerous territory. He had that fight with Anderson Silva, and people weren't happy with it, and they're saying, he was going easy on his mentor, whatever that is. I'd love to ask him about it, even though he'd probably give me some answer that tells me nothing. Then you have this fight with Romero that isn't great. Now this third fight, you have to figure out, if you have another dud, especially against Paulo Costa, who, everybody, especially Israel, was talking about, he'll come forward, he'll give me a fight. All right, man, but if he's coming forward, you got to come forward too. I mean, now it's up to you. So if he gives us another third fight now that's very lackluster and stuff, that's really going to hurt him. And even though he's this great striker and it's really impressive what he's doing on the feet, people are just going to remember him for that, and that would be unfortunate. So it's really for him. This next fight, he's got to be able to wipe people's memory about it. And, that way we can kind of put the blame on Romero and then move on. But it's very important that he does that in the next fight. In terms of Yoel Romero, I think we've seen plenty of fights, not quite to this extreme, but he tends to wait, and then you make that mistake and he jumps on you. This was, once again, the extreme version of that. So for Romero, it could potentially hurt. And, I do want to keep talking about Romero, because we do have El Kukui Holloway who's asking, which makes a lot of sense. If Yoel doesn't go to 205, should he consider a different promotion? And I know you talked about that a little bit on your show, so I do want to start with you. What's your take on Yoel at this point, since we're talking about it?
Well, I think he should go to 205. And I know people will say, well, he's undersized and he'll probably never fight John Jones because they're good friends. But I just look at that division and I just think there's more interesting matchups at this point. Like, yeah, Romero could stay at middleweight and he could fight Calvin Gastelum. He could fight Darren Till. He could fight Jared Cantner. He could fight whoever, right? But the problem is then you're knocking off one of those contenders who actually should have a legit shot at the title. Like I said, 4 title shots. Like, no one seems to look at that. I haven't heard anyone talk about the fact that he's had 4 title shots. Like, go to a different division. He's not making 170. He'd have to cut off a leg to do that. But if he goes to 205, which he's had weight cut issues in the past. If you remember, he would have won the interim title against Rockhold if he would have made weight, but he didn't, and he knocked Rockhold out, but he didn't get the belt. And then he missed weight again against Whittaker in the rematch. But why not try 205? I was just saying today in my Q&A column, him and Rumble Johnson, how cool would that fight be? I know he's undersized. I know he's a shorter middleweight, he'd be a shorter fighter at 205, but so is Daniel Cormier, and he can pack a punch. So I think that, him moving up, it seems like a good option. It would be more fun fights. I just don't get this thinking of where they're going to give him a 5th title shot when you have Paulo Costa, you've got Whittaker, you got Gastelum, you got Till now. That's 4 fighters that are contenders in that division. Plus Jack Hermanson, if he goes and beats Weidman, he could get back in the picture too. So to me, I just think that Yoel's just kind of clogging up the contenders right now, and I just don't see a reason for him to stay around. But what do I know? I'm just a lowly guy behind a keyboard here.
Yeah, the biggest thing for me is when you hear fighters talk about retirement, the main thing they say is, oh, when I'm no longer contending for a title, that's what I'm going to call it. Because if I'm not contending for it, what's the point of sticking around? If you've had 4 title shots, missed weight for half of them in this one division, I mean, at least you're not going to get another one. You're not Holly Holm. You're not going to be able to make it work. So, yeah, we mentioned 205. If you're not going to go to 205, I mean, what's the point of sticking around at 185? Listen, he has losses to Costa, now to Israel. I mean, Whittaker, he's lost enough times that it's going to be tough to get that title shot. And if he does beat somebody, like you mentioned, he's going to be cutting off another contender and he's going to be clogging up that division. So, yeah, 205, why not give it a shot? You have some people in there that are tall for sure. You've got Anthony Smith, 6'4", and things like that. But there are plenty of winnable fights at 205. I don't think anybody's been worried about going to 205 and facing all these killers. You could probably fight your way to a title shot. John Jones, we're seeing him start to hang in the balance a little bit with his title shot talks to Dominic Reyes and stuff. So if I'm him, I wouldn't even worry about potentially meeting John Jones. It would just be, might as well go to 205 and give it a shot, because middleweight, you've pretty much done everything. I don't see where it makes sense that you get a title shot. Even this last title shot, they gave it to him, and let's be honest, he didn't deserve it. El Kukui Holloway asks, should he go to a different promotion? I would certainly think about it. You look at PFL, for example, and you got that million. Even though they don't have a 185, even if they did, who out there would give Yoel Romero a challenge? Bellator, there could be some fun fights as well. I mean, I think money's the thing for him. But if you don't go to 205 in the UFC, I really don't see what's the point of sticking around at this point.
Yeah, that is something to consider about going to a different promotion, just because he's sort of stuck. And like I said, I don't think, if he goes to 205, I don't see Jones losing his title anytime soon, although that last fight was really close. Actually, the last two fights were close, but I know they're good buddies. They both are managed by have the same management group. But yeah, if he went to Bellator, I mean, imagine him and Mousasi, imagine him and Ryan Bader. Like, those would be fun fights. Like, it's something to consider. If he wants to keep fighting, that's fine. But I don't think the UFC is just going to let him go over there. He's a pretty decent draw as far as what we've seen with the numbers. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, I mean, he's in that kind of that Rich Franklin zone, although like on steroids, because like he's lost, like he's had 3 title shots, and like 2 of the, like Whittaker could potentially get the title back then. And I don't think anyone wants to see a trilogy between them at this point with him losing the first 2. So I don't know. I think at middleweight, he's going to run out of options fairly quickly as far as contenders. So I wouldn't mind. I actually wouldn't mind at all if he went to Bellator. I think that would be interesting, because Mousasi, like I interviewed him this week. It'll be on the podcast next week, but yeah, like he's like, I asked him, I said, what's next after Lima? Is it John Salter? Like, really, who are you looking at as far as middleweight? Because Lovato's on the sidelines, and I asked him about Lovato, and he thinks that Lovato's probably done fighting with his unfortunate health issues. But like John Salter and Mousasi, and then after that, who? Like, is the only other middleweight contender is Costello Vencinas, who's his teammate. They're not going to fight. So like Bellator is going to run into some problems there. Imagine Yoel Romero over there. Imagine him and Mousasi. That'd be a great fight. So yeah, it's something he should consider. But I think the UFC is going to keep him around.
All right. Somebody asked a question about Anthony Johnson. I did mention we'll get to him. First things first, I want to ask my question, then we'll throw in his second on top of it. So it was, where should Anthony Johnson return? What division? 205, 265? There's talks of both. Now, here's the question from Brian Redband. Thoughts on Anthony Johnson, planning on coming back this year, but he hasn't re-entered the USADA testing pool, which is a great question, a great point. First things first, what's your take on Anthony Johnson's return?
Well, I think it was inevitable. I remember I was at his last fight against Cormier in Buffalo a couple of years ago, and I think that with the division being the way it is, with Cormier not being the light heavyweight champion anymore, where Rumble had lost to him, I think it certainly adds. I mean, the fight everyone's always wanted to see is Rumble Johnson and John Jones. So I think him being at like him going to 205 would make more sense than him staying at heavyweight, because heavyweight, like, it sounds like we're going to get DC and Stipe, the trilogy fight, but you've got so many contenders waiting in the wings, and you still got big fights coming up. Like you have Nagano and Rosenstruik, you have Curtis Blades and Volkov. There's still a lot of, contenders in that division. And like heavyweight, like, I mean, Jones is kind of running out of contenders at this point. Like if Johnny Walker wins this weekend, he might get him, put in that conversation. There's some people who want to see the rematch with Reyes. So like heavyweight, even though it is like a tiny bit muddled, I think heavyweight's even worse. So I would like to see Rumble Johnson fight at 205. And I think there could be some really fun matchups for him there.
Yeah, for sure. I'd like to see Rumble at 205 also. I mean, last time he was at 205, the only guy who was beating him was Daniel Cormier. Everyone he was facing, Glover Teixeira, even Ryan Bader. I mean, he's knocking them all out cold, I think, first round every single time. So that if you go to 205, there's a good chance you're going to get to the title sooner rather than later. And now there's some fresh matchups. I mean, you think about him versus Anthony Smith, Thiago Santos. I mean, you mentioned it, potentially Yoel Romero. There's so many fun fights for him. It makes sense. I believe he told Rodney James Edgar that he weighs about 235. 235 for 205, that makes sense. I mean, a lot of guys, they cut 30 pounds. I mean, I'm sure during camp you get a little bit lighter. So 205 sounds like a realistic return. The question about, what are your thoughts, but he hasn't re-entered the USADA testing pool. I watched his Food Truck Diaries with Brendan Schaub. I know I probably shouldn't watch Brendan Schaub content, but I did. And
you gotta watch everything, but yeah, anyways, yeah.
You got to learn from it. The big thing I gathered was Anthony Johnson, I'm going to be careful what words I use, but how big he was with the traps the size of watermelons, that was not natural. Mm-hmm. And that's what I gathered from him, basically saying, he was on some supplements that he had to get off of. So for me, it's like if he's not back in USADA yet, yes, he's got to get back down. He's got to get clean. I mean, you see how slim he looks now compared to then, which for me isn't a big deal if you can get back to being clean and everything. But that at first for me was the biggest thing on why he's not with USADA yet. But now for sure you're talking about, yeah, I'm going to return soon. I'm going to return soon. Until you get back with USADA, though, I'm going to be a little cautious about his return date and whether or not he's actually returning, because we know USADA can be a pain in the ass unless Dana White puts his foot down and he's like, look, he's like Brock Lesnar. We're going to sweep you to the side and make it happen. But it does worry me a little bit that he hasn't re-entered the USADA testing pool yet.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. I think pretty much everyone feels the same way as far as him and his physique and how he looked and everything like that. And I think yeah, that's why you haven't, because it was weird, right? Like they announced, like I remember Ali Abdelaziz's manager announcing, like I think last year that he was coming back, right? So here we are in March, not a word of a fight booking or anything lined up. So and now would be a good time with Jones defeating Reyes and defeating Santos and all that and everything else, that he would sort of be the next guy, because they're obviously not in a rush to do Blachowicz and John Jones next. Doesn't seem like it anyway. So I mean, yeah, why wouldn't he be back now? So yeah, I think you're onto something there with that, and we'll just see when he actually is ready to go. But yeah, obviously you need to get in the USADA testing pool before you have your next fight booked.
All right, let's talk a little bit about UFC 248. We saw the co-main event. A lot of people talking about, greatest of all time. I think that's everyone's favorite, phrase. GOAT's the favorite word in MMA. For you, and I know it's a tough question to answer, but do you think this could potentially be the greatest women's fight of all time?
Yes, it's up there. I mean, I'd have to go back. I mean, there's a lot of women WMMA fan like nerds who are like immediately like, what are you talking about? This fight from, whatever, Tough Enough or whatever, like ages ago. Like I haven't watched all the women's MMA fights. Like I haven't even watched every Invicta card. So I'm sure there's fights that are probably up there. I know they actually had a fight on Friday with Invicta that was very good. Lisa, I forget her last name because she just got married, but she had like a really big cut over her face. That was pretty entertaining as well. I'm sure there's fights that are, maybe more ahead of it, but yeah, it's one of the best fights. I saw, one of the questions I was asked today is, is this the top 5 UFC fight of all time? I say no. I mean, MMA fights, I should say, not UFC. I had Chandler Alvarez ahead. I had Shogun Rua, Dan Henderson. I had Jones Gustafson. I had McDonald Lawler, and even Edgar Maynard ahead of that fight. Like, it was a great fight. I'm not downplaying that at all. But if we're talking top 5, there's got to be like one of those like, oh my God moments. And I didn't think there was one in that fight, other than looking at Joanna's head after the fight. But it was a great fight, and it certainly deserves top 10 fight all time consideration, but not top 5 in my opinion. As far as the women's fights go, I'd have to refer to someone like Drake Riggs or someone that's really more enriched in the history of women's mixed martial arts, because I'm sure there's some fights I'm missing from there. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's one of the best women's fights of all time, but as far as the overall fights, it's not in my top 5. Yeah, I mean,
MMA suffers a lot from recency bias. Every time John Jones wins, he's the GOAT. Demetrius Johnson was with the UFC. He wins. Oh, now he's the GOAT. George St. Pierre came back. He won. Oh, now he's the GOAT. So, we love throwing the word GOAT at stuff. For me, obviously, it's a great fight. Usually when there's scary moments, like someone almost gets finished, that adds to it. Obviously, her hematoma was great, but that's not enough to consider the fight greatest of all time based on just one sort of injury type thing. It's a great fight, but you mentioned a great point. We have to go back and really watch all these women's fights. I mean, it happened in the UFC, so it got more eyeballs, but there could be something on an Invicta undercard that nobody thought to watch that could have turned out to be a better fight in terms of excitement and everything. So is it up there top 5 fights of the UFC in all time? Definitely not. I mean, just listening to your list, it's like, wait a minute, that fight was not better than those fights.
It's got to have like a wow moment. I just never got that in that fight. It was again, it was a great fight, but it wasn't like even with Jones and Gustafson, there was a point where you thought Gustafson might be able to finish Jones, and I just didn't feel like that. Like Joanna was ever doing that to Zhang, like at any point. She definitely had a good game plan. By the way, quickly, I don't want to interrupt the flow of this thing, but Brett Okamoto just announced Robert Whittaker and Darren Till to headline UFC Dublin on August 15th. Just throwing that out there. Don't want to segue away from the show, but I thought I'd point that out in case you missed it.
I did miss it, so this is news to me. You broke the news.
I'm reading it right now. That's an awesome fight.
Yeah, let's talk about it. We get the quick reactions.
That's why I'm here. I got to stay on top of things. So there you go.
Perfect. So let's start with you. What's your take on this fight?
Great matchmaking. Darren Till earned a huge win over Calvin Gastelum. Which is such a high stakes fight for Darren Till, because he had come off 2 losses, and here he is moving up to 85 against Calvin Gastelum, the man who nearly beat Israel Adesanya. He dropped him in, I think it was the 4th round. I was like, what is the UFC doing here? They have this relatively young UK fighter who's a huge draw, who people love. You're going to fly him all the way to New York, and he's got to fight Kelvin Gastelum, who, like I said, nearly beat Israel Adesanya, and Till whooped his ass. I mean, I was at that fight. It was complete domination. Till clearly won the fight. So now he's in that spot. Like, it was a high risk, high reward thing. He had come off 2 losses. He came up to middleweight, looked great, got the win. This is great matchmaking right here, because you have Whittaker, who just lost his title to Israel Adesanya late last year. And now you have, Darren Till, who's this new contender who has emerged because of the win over Gastelum. And now honestly, this is the type of matchmaking I love, because it's got 2 things. Number one, does Whittaker still have it? Was the accumulation of injuries, a thing in that fight with Adesanya? Is that why he lost? Or is it that Adesanya is that much better? We're going to find out in this fight, because I'll tell you what, if Robert Whittaker beats Darren Till, he's right back in the driver's seat. Now, conversely for Darren Till, was it just that he got Gastelum on an off night, or did he fight, a guy that is a legit contender? If he takes out Robert Whittaker, I mean, all of a sudden we have to talk about Darren Till and Israel Adesanya, assuming Adesanya gets past Costa. Like, this just adds so much more to this division. I love this fight, and they're so smart for doing this in Dublin, because if you remember, they were supposed to do that card in Dublin a couple of years ago, and I believe they tried to do Darren Till and Gunnar Nelson, but for some reason Nelson couldn't go, and the whole reason they wanted it in Dublin was because of Nelson being part of SBG Ireland. So they actually moved the card to to Liverpool, I think, where Till's from, and they did Wonder Boy and Till instead, and that was a terrible decision, by the way. But it was so now they get to do this in Dublin, and you got 2 fighters that are bigger internationally. Love the matchmaking. Your thoughts?
Oh man, Dublin, they get themselves a great main event. I mean, people were like, it's Conor McGregor or bust, but it's like, man, this is a great fight for sure. What's refreshing about it is you feel like this is going to keep the division moving along. I mean, Whittaker was the champion not too long ago, lost that fight to Israel. This is a good bounce back fight to determine where he is in the division. Darren Till, he beat Kelvin Gastelum. And, for some people, like, oh, well, Gastelum's a smaller middleweight. He didn't fight, I guess, a real middleweight despite everything that Gastelum's done. So, this is the fight that's going to show us where both guys are in this division. I love the matchmaking. I love the actual matchups. I'm thinking, about, is Whittaker durable enough to go out there against Darren Till? Darren Till with hopefully no home cooking. We get to see him 5 rounds. And, it's going to be it's a great fight. And it's going to determine maybe not who gets the next title shot, but it's going to get you really close. It doesn't block anybody else from, moving along in this division. So I like everything about it. I like the matchup as well. The fact that it's 5 rounds too, I feel like we can almost guarantee a finish. I'm going to be careful, because after UFC 248's main event, I don't want to play with the MMA guys and be careful. But I love the matchmaking for this one. It's a really great fight, and it feels refreshing that it keeps the division moving, and it's a fight that truly makes sense, especially ranking-wise.
Yeah, and I feel a little bad for Jared Cantnier. I know he's injured right now, so he's sort of the odd man out of this situation. But either way, I think now with this fight announcement, I don't know where Calvin Gastelum's at, but I think now you would, depending on when Cantnier's ready, you would do Gastelum and Cantnier, I would think, or something, because he's got to fight someone ranked high. Like, to me, I was beating this drum as it's a very small drum, because apparently no one else wanted to see it. But I thought Cantnier should have got the title shot against Adesanya, because he beat Jack Hermanson. Wouldn't have mattered because he was injured anyways. But Cantnier's right up there. And actually, Cantnier could also wait out for the winner of Costa and Adesanya. We'll see. But I mean, this certainly is, adding a lot of sizzle to this division, and it needs it after that main event for sure. So.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Jared Cannonier. I'm not too worried about him, because, he gets to, nobody's going to pressure him to go back out there. He gets to rehab from, I believe it was a pec injury or something like that. So he gets to come back whenever he's ready. And I feel like he's not going to lose any steam. No matter what Hermanson does, he lost by a knockout to Cannonier. So he's always going to have that little bit of a leg up. You could potentially face the winner of Whittaker versus Till, or you could get a title shot. I feel like either way, he's going to be up at the division, and he's on hold and not so much going to get shoot to the side. So for him, obviously you feel bad, because it's like he's very close, could have gotten the Till fight, but it doesn't really derail him too much. If he gets the right matchup when he comes back, he's in the right place. But yeah, I mean, the division feels like it's a little bit more wide open now. Like, these fights are coming together. You mentioned Cannonier versus Kelvin. This fight, I mean, it feels like the division is going in the right direction with this fight. And, it's going to be interesting to see who can get next in line after Costa and everything gets figured out.
And you wonder in a way too if Dana White's just like, hey, we got to hurry this thing up and get some good news going with the middleweight division because of that fight, because that's whatever, you don't want bad press like we've had with this fight and people talking about it. So I think this is good on the UFC here. Now they just got to get on the coronavirus, but other than that, they're doing pretty good this week. So.
All right, so moving on to another topic. I have a wild card topic, which I did.
Love it. I love the wild cards. Throw whatever you got at me. I'm ready. I got my Final Fight shirt on today, so I'm ready to go.
There we go. See, in the past, I usually tell people like, oh, the first episode, for example, we talked about Brendan Schaub covering MMA, and people are always sad 'cause they're like, damn it, I want to talk about it. Unfortunately, we're not going to talk about it, but because I have one of the greatest interviewers in the MMA media, and maybe even outside of MMA media, we know that when it comes to the video interviews, you're number one. Got to give them the props. Here's the question. Here's the topic. I'm sure you watch a lot of content, a lot of people that do interviews, a lot of journalists in this MMA media. What are some of these mistakes? What are some of the things you watch in interviews that make you cringe, that you go like, come on, man, you got to fix that? Even stuff that I do, right? Like I'm the host, but, grill me if you have to. But I mean, what are some things that you see in a lot of the mistakes?
Well, it's a couple things. Like I think a lot of people try and do video content and they're not like, they don't have the reps in. Like you got to do the reps. Look at how many interviews I did on my old channel, before I got this job at the Score. Like it was like, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and fighters that, some fighters that have gone to the UFC and I've been able to, maintain those relationships. And then there's fighters that have done nothing since I interviewed them. Right. Like you have to treat every interview the same. I mean, I remember going to cover like, a big UFC event and then going to do like a regional show like a week later. So you have to learn something from all of that. And I think that one of the keys is just, practicing and also learning how to get better, asking for feedback. Like I've seen some people do video content and then they're on Twitter and they're like, let me know what you think. And like, that's dumb, because like, what does Twitter know about good content? Like ask people that actually have been successful at it. Like ask people, like for me, when I was coming up, like the only people that were doing video interviews, like the Skype style, were Frank Trigg, who I was working with at Oddsbreaker at the time, and Karen Bryant. And so I would sort of see what they were doing and how their setup was and stuff. And that's sort of how I modeled how I was doing thing. On top of all that, I also I consume content all the time. I consume as much, like one of the first things I do when I get up in the morning after I go to the gym and meditate and all that stuff is I look on my YouTube channel. And if you look, like I got it right here, my second screen, I have probably I have 205 subscriptions on my YouTube. And I watch everything. Like I don't watch it fully, but I'll if I see something that catches my eye, I'll check it out, because I like watching everything. And I think even the bad stuff, you can take some stuff away and just see what type of content people are producing. But it's a couple things that sort of come to mind. Number one, be well researched. Like there's nothing worse than I watched an interview the other day with someone who interviewed Felicia Spencer, and they're like, you're coming off a big win over someone, and I don't want to butcher their name. And it's like, yeah, like I butcher names too. But that's your lead. That's what you're starting with. There's no way I'm going to watch the rest of this interview, because you're not even prepared. So come prepared. And I know sometimes you can't, because I get interviews at the last minute. Sometimes you just got to, roll with the punches. Production's a big thing. It's pretty easy. This, Lucas, it's not that hard to create a good quality product with the webcam I'm using here is a Logitech webcam, couple $100. You can get a HD webcam for under $100. This mic I'm using is not a, one of those expensive XLR mics. It's a regular USB mic, again, about $100. That's all you got to do, and add a couple graphics, read a couple tutorials online about how to make graphics, on Adobe Premiere or whatever, and just to pick up some pointers. There's lots of tutorials on YouTube on how to make your product look good. But, I see some people just putting out just really low quality content. I had people tell me oh, all you need to do is build a studio and do all this. It's I don't think there's much of a difference between what I'm doing here and what Ariel's doing, to be honest. And he has an entire production putting this together. To me, if the content looks decent enough, or it's HD and you can hear the sound okay and it's not muddled, then I think it's fine. I don't think you need to be like some people really go heavy on the production. And I think that's great. But at the end of the day, it's all about the content. So really drive up good content. One of the other things is, something that you and I've talked about is when you're making your interview, when you're doing your interviews, make your title something that people, it doesn't have to be clickbait. I know that I hate that word sometimes, where people are like, oh, it's clickbait, but make something that's going to get me interested in watching it. If you say such and such discusses their fight at Bellator, 241, there's a million preview my fight against Bellator 241 interviews that are doing that exact same thing. So, I would look at kind of spicing it up. Is there a good quote? One of the things I like doing in my interviews is also talking to them about news topics. So I remember a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago, when I interviewed Andrea Lee, for example, she talked about her fight and there was no real notable quotes in there, but I asked her about Macy Barber. And, I think the quote I got out of her was, I didn't like the way she handled the loss. And so that was the title. And of course, people are going to want to hear her thoughts on that. So always sort of incorporate some news topics in there as well. And these are things that I've learned sort of over the year. And I don't have all the answers. I've just, I know a thing or two, I would say, but that's one too. and just really not being afraid to interview everyone. Like I see a lot of up and coming people trying to take shortcuts, people trying to just interview, like people asking me, like they've done like one podcast episode, they're like, hey, do you think you get me like Paige Van Zant's contact? No, A, I don't know you, and B, like you got to put in the reps, otherwise you're going to look like a dummy when you do interview someone big. Like people have this idea that like, oh, I just got to get one interview and it's going to go viral. No, that's not the answer. Longevity in this industry, or people have put in the reps. Go look at Luke Thomas's YouTube channel. Go look at Sort By and go look at the first video he ever did. He's been doing his channel for like 10 years. Ariel, same thing. I remember when Ariel, even before MMA fighting, was doing MMA Rated. Like he's been in this for 10 years. He didn't just wake up one day and get hired at ESPN. It was, 10 years of work. So if you want to be successful in this industry and you want to actually have it as your job, you got to think long-term, and you can't just look for shortcuts. So that's something I see a lot of too. And you just can't expect to, get one viral interview and that's the answer. No, it's not. It's putting in the work. It's making relationships. Like I can walk into, I don't know how many gyms right now in the US and in Canada, and I can walk in and I guarantee you there's people who know who I am, whether I've interviewed a teammate or I've interviewed, one of the more notable fighters there. It's all about building those relationships. So that's another big thing too. I think I'm running out of ideas at this point, but yeah, just those are sort of the basic things I would think. I know I said a lot there, but just, again, and really the biggest thing I can recommend is just watch people who are successful with content. Like, people make fun of Brendan Shaw, but he's got good production. Why? Because he works for Showtime, and they actually like film stuff quite well, and it's good. So you can take something from that. And yeah, he says a lot of dumb stuff, but Brendan's still out. What he's doing, think about it. If Brendan was so bad at his job, why would Showtime invest so much time into him? Obviously, he's doing something right. So there's people out there who I don't like their content, but they're successful. But it is what it is. Like you can pick up something from everyone. So don't say I'm not going to watch that. Try and watch everything. Try and learn, and more importantly, ask for advice and ask for feedback. That's what'll get you ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I can weigh in on a little bit of stuff too, because I made a lot of mistakes. That's kind of the thing that I can add. And plus, I've been doing the video interviews almost 2 years now, which is crazy to think. But an example you mentioned, getting that one big name that's going to blow up. A big example that happened this week, I interviewed Sean O'Malley, and I also talked to Muhammad Usman. When you hear those names, like, oh, okay, Sugar Sean O'Malley is going to get a lot of views. And Muhammad Usman ended up getting a lot more. Part of that's my fault. I need to do a little bit of better job promoting him and things like that. But it's just an example for that. The biggest thing I can draw on my experience, some of the mistakes I did, is I half-assed way too much at the beginning. Like I had a shitty laptop, which you found out firsthand when you had on my show, and everything kept crashing. Laptop was shitty, webcam was shitty, there was no mic. I ended up going on MMA World and doing some interviews, and all the comments, everyone's shitting on me. People are coming after me. And you know what? I was able to pick up a few things. Like, maybe I should get a mic. It's time to upgrade the webcam. Over the winter, I finally got a better laptop, and the quality looks a lot better. So it was harsh, and there were times where you wanted to go on Mark Hunt and like, why don't you take your advice and fuck off? But there's some stuff that help. I think that the biggest thing is definitely not half-assing in the production value. You know what I mean? Like creating like a little like a border around your video, like you do, like I do, like Mike Heck, all these people. It seems difficult. It's really not that hard. If I can figure out how to do it, anybody can figure it out. I mean, it just the production quality is so important, because even if nobody knows you, which is the case for a lot of my interviews, people are like, who is this guy? How's he getting them? But you know what? At least my stuff, it looks pretty professional, and that's going to help you go a long way. But yeah,
couple quick things I just wanted to mention here, because you did bring up something I was just thinking about. As far as like the production and things like that, like there's like I said, there's a lot of tutorials online on how to do it. It doesn't have to be complicated. Like even Mike, like once you have a template, you can just edit it, you can put it together. Like as long as it looks like halfway decent, like the content is really what people are after. Like I'll watch through some stuff. Like one of the things that drives me nuts, and I've mentioned this on Twitter before, and there's still some prominent journalists who do this, is when they do their interviews over the phone, they put it on speaker and they put it up to the microphone. Stop doing that. Like it sounds terrible. And you can get MP3 Skype recorder for Skype for $3 a month. It's nothing. It's a tax write-off for me. Just go and do that, and then you get the direct feed, because it sounds terrible. There's no reason to do it. And you can get like a clean audio feed. One thing I'll mention, like, because you just brought it up there, like your Mo Usman video did better views than the Sean O'Malley interview. I can tell you exactly why that happened. And this is something that I'm a little bit more conscious of too, and it didn't happen until recently. So Sean O'Malley, what show was he on this week besides yours?
Oh yeah, I guess he was on everything.
So the thing is, like, even if you found a completely different angle that about Sean O'Malley that Ariel didn't discover, the chances of someone watching that over yours would be, or watching, for example, watching your interview as opposed to watching Ariel's, or just watching both is kind of slim. So sometimes what I like doing is, if Ariel gets a guest on, maybe I'll get them on the week after while things have sort of simmered down, and watch that interview and take something from there that wasn't said. Like, Gegard, for example, Gegard Mousasi. everyone did the media day stuff with him this week. And I thought about putting him on the podcast this week because I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll just stack the podcast this week. I'll stack the deck because I already have Bisping and I had Sandhagen and Felicia Spencer and all these other people and Pitbull. But I was like, no, you know what? I'll wait till next week. I'll wait till this dies down a little bit. Then I'll put him on next week. I got him on video. It was a great interview, by the way. Like, I'm excited for you guys to see it. It'll be out next week. But, there's not going to be fatigue on that. Here's another example kind of, relating to that point. I had this really great interview with Israel Adesanya last week. I wasn't able to get him on video, but I got him on, on audio. And I did the interview, and the views were okay. But I thought, you know what? I'll isolate this clip of him talking about the judges because it was a great rant. He really went off on the judges, and he brought up some good points about how the scoring system should go. I put the video up on Friday. It did terrible, and terrible by my standards is anything under 1,000 views. So now I was like, why the heck did this happen? And you know what? I thought about it. I'm like, I know exactly why it didn't do well. It's fatigue. How many interviews did Israel Adesanya do last week? Probably 1 million. Like, how much media was there at UFC 248? So even though I took an angle with judging, I realized that I think he did something similar with MMA fighting where he talked about the judging. So people were already reading that. And I thought, oh, well, maybe YouTube would be different. It didn't matter. I think it only did like 500 views, which is not good by my standards these days. So yeah, that's something to be conscious of as well. That's why it's important to watch other people's content so you know what's out there. And sometimes it can work, but I think in a lot of cases, like the reason the Usman video did so well is like no one, to my knowledge, has interviewed Usman about PFL since he signed. So that's a great interview, and that's why the content did well. And I watched your interview with, actually, I watched both of them. I watched the O'Malley and I watched the Usman interview. But I've interviewed Mo before, but I was curious, to watch it and hear his decision on that. And I actually, PFL actually reached out to me and asked me who I wanted to interview. And I said Mo Usman, but because I know you interviewed him this week, but if I get him next week or the week after, then at least it's going to space it out a little bit. So that's another piece of advice I'd like to do as I interrupted you there. But yeah.
No, it's a great point you bring up about the recording the phone with the microphones. I think we've all done that. I was doing it at first and I was doing like the written interview, but it doesn't matter. Nobody's going to hear that. It's just about transcribing. But you mentioned Israel Adesanya, same thing. I'm trying to get that interview with Israel, and they're like, hey, listen, we can give you 7 minutes over the phone in like 30 minutes. And I was like, look, you know what? I know it's a big interview, but if it's going to come out like shitty on my end, like the audio's bad and stuff like that, it's not worth it. As much as I wanted to talk to him, because I haven't been able to talk to him in forever, I was like, you know what? Even if it gets views, I don't want to put more half-assed stuff out there. So that, I'm going to hold back on that one as much as I didn't want to. It was tough, but yeah, I mean, the production value is important, the audio. But it's a great point you bring up about the Sean O'Malley, because honestly, I didn't even think that. I don't really watch that much of the big people's content. I'm just like, Sean O'Malley's coming off the win. Let me try to get as much UFC 248 guys as I can.
And he's a big name. Like, I like the thinking there where it's like he just won his fight. But you know what I do every Sunday is I look at who Ariel gets. And then I sort of gauge on who I should be interviewing. Like, I remember he got on someone recently and I was like, damn it, I was just going to actually, you know what happened? Colby Covington did an interview the same day I did. And it was just a coincidence. I didn't know that Colby was going to do Ariel's show as well. Luckily, I was able to do that interview and get it up in like right away. So I still got a lot of views on it. And that was one of the situations where it did work out in my favor. And I also touched on some stuff that Ariel did, and I kind of got lucky there. But when it came to writing the article, because I was concerned, like, obviously he's talking about 50 Cent and he's talking about the Usman loss or whatever. I'm trying to remember what I even talked about there. I think it was something different that I took as far as the angle as what I went with as far as what he talked about for the article. So the article still did well because, it was Conor McGregor. That's what it was. And people are like, duh, of course he's going to fight Conor McGregor. But I'm like, that's something that Ariel didn't really discuss with him. So I was like, because I had the advantage of like, I think just before I went on, I kind of saw what he was talking about. So I sort of knew what to ask him that hadn't been asked. So that's another thing. And it's tough. Like Mike Heck always talks about, watching everyone's interviews. Sometimes you can't, sometimes it's just the timing of it doesn't work out or whatever, but try to the best you can and just try and go for there. And yeah, that's that. Like your O'Malley interview would have been good if you would have, like, I don't know if Ariel touched about this, but maybe just getting him his thoughts on the main event. And just going with that angle and saying like, what did you think? Who did you think won? Whatever, like that, because that's how you have to get creative. And again, like I should point out to people watching, like, like yours, like, oh yeah, so obvious. Like I didn't know a lot of this stuff even like a year ago, and it's literally trial and error and just seeing how YouTube works, and it's still complicated. Like I still haven't figured all this out, but I just know that for me, it's sort of a learning process, and there's no blueprint out there, so that's why I don't mind. Like I'll do a couple videos on my channel to like lend some advice and help people. And I always tell people this, like, DM me on Twitter. My DMs are always open. Like if I can give any sort of advice to make people better, I'm glad to do it because no one really was there for me to do it. So I'm happy to sort of pass it on.
And you mentioned the unique thing, like, I busted my ass making this video for 2 weeks with all the female fighters talking about the DMs they get. I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to announce it. I wanted everybody to know, like, I'm working on this and stuff. But I was like, you know what? It's going to be so easy take someone like The Athletic. That seems like something they would do where they release this big article on it. So I was like, you know what? Just be quiet, hunker down, get as much as you can. It ended up doing great. For my channel numbers, that's like, the biggest thing ever, most viewed video. Maybe for the score, probably not so much, but no, I was happy with it. And I think a big thing is it was unique. I looked everywhere. You couldn't find anybody talking about it or anything. So, it is important to find those angles. But yeah, marketing these interviews, I know I suck at it. Like, you look at the channel numbers, like, come on, man. I have people all the time tell me I suck at marketing it because they're like, man, why are you getting such shit numbers? And yeah,
well, what you could do too is like you gotta, and we all have to do this now. And I think like I didn't do this when I started either. Is like get a couple like good quotes from your interview and put them on Twitter, put them on Facebook, and just that way it gets people in there, and put it on Instagram, and then that way that little clip will be like, oh, I'm curious to hear like his full answer. That's something you got to start doing too. Not that this is like the James Lynch like teacher special or whatever, but no, that's something that I've had to do too. Where it's like, and that's why the articles help as well. Cause like usually what I'll do now, I don't do as many clips as I used to. I'm still trying to pump that out as much as I can. But with me not doing as many videos on the channel, I do a lot more articles. And the idea with the articles is that will lead to, people going to the video or vice versa. Yeah. So that obviously helps too.
Honestly, the biggest thing I hate about the quotes is the transcribing. I spent 1 year with Flow Combat, with MMA Latest, I was transcribing all the time, every day, every interview. I got so sick of it.
That was me too. Yeah.
I mean, you want to throw your computer through a window and, why can't these guys just email me the answers? Transcribing while I get to rant about it is probably one of the worst things in the world, one of the worst things in this industry for sure.
It is, but you got to do it. And that's the other thing. It'll make you more versatile. Like my writing was never a strong suit. I sort of went all in on the video and, it worked out for me, but I'm learning now, especially being at the Score, like a bigger platform, like I have to be able to write well. And I've learned so much since being there. Like I'm going to be coming up to my 1 year anniversary in May. And, my writing has improved tremendously because I'm actually working with a group of editors who are like really helping me out and, with my grammar and just, formatting and all that stuff. And it's just a skill you need to have because like, think about it. If you want it, like people talk to me all the time about like, how do I get hired full time? Like a lot of it is just being versatile. And one of the things I forgot to mention earlier that I was going to bring up is like, I got kind of lucky in the sense that I have an editing background. Like my day job used to be in television editing videos. So I had that advantage going into all this where I basically made all my own graphics and edited my own video. I didn't have to learn anything. I already knew how to do it. So that was a big advantage. But yeah, if you can be more versatile, if you know how to shoot video, if you can edit video, if you can, be on air, if you can write your own questions, then that just makes you better than like so many other people. And I think a lot of people have faltered because they haven't picked up those skills. So it's just a good habit to get into. You're bigger. You don't have to write up every interview. I don't write up all of them, but some of the bigger ones, like Bisping yesterday, got a good quote from him about the Adesanya fight. That's doing well on the Score right now. So that's something to keep in mind too, is just to really try and be versatile. That's an advice out there for any of the media people.
And here's one thing I did want to touch on about the interviews. I also want to get your opinion on. One thing I stopped doing about a year ago is I stopped writing down questions and I stopped preparing questions. I just had I do a quick Google search, think about what can be some talking points, and I really force myself to listen and if they make a great point, like go ahead and jump on that and try to make it as much of a conversation as I can. Part of being shit on an MMA world, it's like, oh, we feel like he's reading off questions. All right, no more reading off questions, and it's terrifying. It really is, because you go into that interview, you feel like you're not prepared, but I feel like it's helped make the interviews a little bit more like a conversation. Obviously, it's a very hard thing to do, but I'm curious, what's your take on writing down questions? Is that something that you do at all?
I just write down bullet points, like of things that I want to talk about, because there are sometimes things that you forget. But here, I'll put you in this scenario, and this happens often. So let's say and this comes with experience. So let's say you go to a UFC event and you're backstage, and typically if you're doing video content, you're in the back and you're waiting for the post-fight winners to come out and you interview them. But they throw out guest fighters sometimes, and you got to interview them, and you have no preparation. Like it could be someone completely random. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, they had Mike Trezano, and who's the other fighter? It was they were both on the Ultimate Fighter. Oh, it was Joe, what's his name? The guy who got cut. Yeah, Giannetti. Yeah. So it was both of them. And like, luckily I had like seen some of their fights on the regional scene. So like I was good, but I remember that scrum, like no one asked questions because no one knew who the heck they were. But I did. So I was kind of lucky there. But in general, I think it's just good to have like a bunch of questions, like kind of as like stock questions in the back of your head. Like, and, I know some of them you need to ask, like, how's camp? And, like all the questions that people hate getting asked, but you still have to ask them anyways. But just always be prepared and always just, come up with and just try and keep things general if you can, if you don't know like a lot to ask. But yeah, bullet points are the way to go. And just, that way you're not like, reading off the script. You can just say, oh yeah, I was going to talk about this. And, sometimes you'll fumble over your words, but you're right. It comes across way better when it's not like, thank you for joining me. I'm so like, it just comes across unnatural and people can smell that a mile away. So it's just important to, I do the bullet points thing and just know who they're fighting, know when they last fought, and just, make it sound like I'm not a complete idiot when I'm doing the interview.
All right, and here's the one last thing I do want to add, since we're talking about, it's not really a mistake, but it's like something I'll watch the interview and it drives me nuts is when the interviewer takes too long to set up the question. Like if I'm gonna wait
Yes.
for 2 minutes while you're giving me all the context, like I know ask the damn question. Like
Yeah.
that honestly, it really frustrates me. Like, I'm gonna be honest with you, man. I'm not watching the interview for you. I want to hear what the fighter says. And I feel like fighters also, like, they're gonna forget if you take 2 minutes to get your question out. Like it's happened before. So honestly, that's the biggest thing for me that'll make me turn off an interview is if you take too damn long to get that question out.
Well, even Ariel does that. And I respect Ariel, and he's been nothing but nice to me. And I'm not crapping on him. I just don't prefer his interview style. But like, this is how Ariel starts his interviews. Ariel Helwani here for ESPN with Drakkar Klose, who's going to be fighting this Saturday at UFC 248 at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. Like, everyone already knows that he's fighting at 248. So just say, I'm here with Drakkar Klose, who's fighting Beneil Dariush. Drakkar, how are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. Like, get to the point. Like, I learned, like, Bob McCown, he was like the biggest, a lot of people don't know who I'm talking about here, but Bob McCown was like the radio, like, king in Canada. Like, he used to be on the Fan 590. He used to host like the #1 sports show here in Canada. And I remember hearing him on Richard Dietish's sports media podcast. And he talked about two things that really stood out to me and something that I use in my interview style. And again, gets back to the point of where you should be watching everything, not just MMA interviews, watch how other sports are doing stuff too. And the two things that he said to me really stuck out. Number one is, get your answers to the point where they're, that you keep them short, because like you said, it gets boring. Like, I feel a lot of people who have the long-winded answers almost do that to like brag about how much knowledge they've researched, when it's like, who cares? Like, the average viewer doesn't give a shit about that. They'll look it up later. Like, just get to the question. So there's that. And number two is always come from the fan perspective. Like, it's good to do research, like you said. And then it's also good, like you said, to kind of just keep it free flowing. And one of the ways to do that is always come at it from the perspective of, has anyone ever seen this fighter before? And is there something you could ask them that would be interesting to just like the average Joe? Keep that in mind too. So it's tough. It's a tough skill to do. And it's something that I've had to really work on over the last couple of years, but just go into it being like, ask the who, what, when, where, why questions, but do it in a way where you're coming at it from a perspective that no one's watched this before, and it can still be compelling and interesting. And also another pet peeve that I see that kind of goes along the same line of thinking is saying, tell me about that. Those like demanding things where it's like, tell me about that, talk about that. Like, that's why we're here. Obviously they're going to talk about it. So just like how I'll frame a question, for example, is like, if a fighter gets signed to the UFC or they get a bout agreement, like, how did this all come together with you, fighting this particular fighter or something? That's different than saying like, tell me about how that went, like it's different. Right. So.
Sure. All right. Well, that's all the time we have. A lot. I mean, anybody's watching this who was wondering how to do interviews, like, now you have about as close to a blueprint as I think you're going to get. So lots of great stuff. So I do appreciate you for joining me, James. I really do. Let the people know one more time, where can we find you on social media, and also what they can look forward to, any content that's going to be coming out that they need to watch out
of stuff. Good thing you asked. You might regret this. It might take a little bit to get through everything. No, so I had the podcast today. Going to plug that again because that's really my baby. That's what I love doing is the podcast every week. So big show this week. Was really lucky to get Michael Bisping on the show. So he was sort of the lead on that. Also got Corey Sandhagen on the show to talk about his fight that he's accepted against Dominic Cruz. It's not official yet, but he's going to talk about that. Patricio Pitbull, the Bellator double champ, he defends his title this Friday at Bellator 241, so you can check that out as well. Really good stuff with him. And one of the things, this is another interview tip as well. So Patricio, I had to use a translator. I hate watching interviews where someone asks the question, the translator translates it, the fighter says it in their native tongue, and then you hear the question there. That's like a 20-minute interview. Yeah. What I do in mine is I ask the question, I edit it, and I put the translator's speech underneath the fighter when they're talking in their native tongue. So that's what I did with the Pitbull interview, and I did it with the Leandro Higo as well, who also does not speak a ton of English. So so I did that. So those interviews are much shorter, so you can look forward to those. One interview that I loved this week, and I hope it gets a lot of attention, but this was like a personal favorite of mine because it was like the first season I ever watched of The Ultimate Fighter. But Mike Swick, really great guy. Used to fight in the UFC, nearly fought Anderson Silva and George St. Pierre. You have to go check out the interview for that. But the cool thing about Mike Swick is he's had this really successful gym in Thailand, AKA Thailand, which is an extension of the AKA gym in California. And Tyron Woodley got to train there for his fight with Leon Edwards. So really good insight from Mike Swick on that. Really cool to go back down on memory lane with him because Swick's a guy that I used to watch in the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. If you remember, he was a semifinalist who fought at light heavyweight, which is crazy because he was a welterweight in the UFC, fought at middleweight as well. So that was cool. Felicia Spencer, also talked to her about her fight against Amanda Nunes at UFC 250. And then I ended things with a prospect. Again, can't just interview UFC and Bellator guys. Got to talk about the up-and-comers. This kid, Anthony Romero, who's out of Welland, Ontario, just got a 58-second knockout. He's 7-0 right now. He is a guy I guarantee see on Contender Series. and maybe will be in the UFC this year. Really cool guy. So sort of getting a look at the future there. So that's the podcast. And then just, my typical stuff, pros picks for this week. I just put up the one for Woodley and Leon Edwards. That's going to take place next week. Also had the preview of the Brasilia card, which takes place this Saturday. That's also on the channel. And I'm going to have a couple other cool things. Oh yeah, tomorrow, quickly, I'll mention this and then we'll wrap things up. I'm doing my early look. So if you haven't watched this show, it's basically I do a live stream. I talk about a big fight that's coming up in a few months. So in this case, I'm going to be talking about Khabib and Ferguson, which is going to be taking place in April. And I'm doing an early preview of that. So I'm going through the stats, nothing too technical, just more so looking at stats. And then I'll be answering questions from people during the stream. So definitely tune into that. That'll be 11 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow, which is Thursday, on the Score MMA channel, which you can subscribe to by going youtube.com/thescoremma. And you see it there in the handle, in the graphic there on the screen here, at Lynch on Sports, Instagram, Twitter. That's where you can find me. And Lucas, thanks so much for having me on. Sorry I rambled a lot, but that's kind of the way I do things.
No, but if I'm gonna have a guest on, I know what I'm getting into. Like, there's no oh, surprise, James Lynch is being himself. Oh no.
Yeah. No, that's
All
good,
right,
man.
so-
No, and love the show, by the way. I want to see more of these debate shows from people. It's a good idea, and I think news topics are something people are passionate, and it's good to incorporate people with that. So I wish you luck with this, and of course growing your channel. And I would encourage everyone who's watching this. I'm sure you all are already, but go subscribe to Lucas's channel. He's doing some great work. So there you go.
Sure, appreciate that.